Hello and welcome to episode 5 of HyperSpace, the fast-paced breakdown place coming to you from colorful Colorado. Since our last episode, we've seen a great deal of activity from a variety of launch providers. Blue Origin successfully completed their first crewed flight, Rocket Lab launched their return-to-flight mission following a more than 2-month absence, Roscosmos had a whirlwind of the week with a launch and subsequent anomalies of their new International Space Station science module at Nauka, Ariane V had a successful launch of 2 new communication satellites, and orbital preparations are in full swing in South Texas. That's all coming up on HyperSpace. Starting off this week's episode, Blue Origin launched the first crewed flight of their New Shepard suborbital rocket on July 20th. The New Shepard booster lifted off from Blue Origin's launch site 1 in West Texas at 8:21 a.m. Central Time. The booster successfully landed back on Earth 7 minutes and 24 seconds later. The capsule reached an apogee of 107 kilometers before a successful touchdown of the crew in the West Texas desert 10 minutes and 18 seconds after launch. Among the crew were Blue Origin's founder Jeff Bezos and Wally Funk. Funk was one of 13 women to complete the equivalency of NASA's astronaut candidacy screening tests in the early 1960s. Funk, as the sole surviving member of the so-called Mercury 13, is the first and only of these women to pass the 100-kilometer Kármán line. Moving back to orbital flight, Rocket Lab launched their It's a Little Chile Up Here return-to-flight mission on Thursday, July 29th at 1 a.m. Central Time. The Electron rocket successfully lifted off from Rocket Lab's Launch Complex 1A on the Mahia Peninsula in New Zealand. This was Rocket Lab's first mission since May 15th after an engine anomaly caused the loss of the second stage and payload. The successful ignition of the second stage 2 minutes and 40 seconds later was met with ovation from the Rocket Lab team, having apparently solved the issue that caused the failure 2 months ago. The exact payload of this launch is classified, but we do know that it is an experimental spacecraft being launched for the United States Space Force. The payload was successfully deployed in low Earth orbit by Electron's third stage 51 minutes and 50 seconds after liftoff. Next up for today's docket, we have quite the saga. Roscosmos has added a new science module to the International Space Station known as Nauka, which is Russian for science. It is the first module to be added to the orbital laboratory by Roscosmos since 2010, but the story of Nauka goes all the way back to the 1990s. The module that ultimately became Nauka was originally intended to be a backup for the very first module of the ISS, Zarya. However, it was never necessary as Zarya remains part of the space station to this day. In 2004, the plan to convert the module to Nauka was revealed, with the module originally intended to be launched in 2007. Almost a decade and a half of delays and the retirement of the space shuttle later, the Nauka was finally launched from Baikonur Cosmodrome Site 200-39 on Wednesday, July 21st at 9:58 a.m. Central. The 2,300-kilogram payload was lofted to orbit by the Proton-M heavy lift launch vehicle. The vehicle's payload capabilities were maxed out by the launch of the Nauka module. Following the separation of the module from the Proton's third stage, the vehicle was met with a number of propulsion and telemetry issues that delayed the rendezvous maneuver burn by 24 hours. The orbital issues were ultimately resolved with 4 correctional burns carried out over July 22nd and 23rd. The module finally docked to the ISS at 8:29 a.m. Central on July 29th, but the anomalies were not over. Hours after docking, a software glitch caused the Nauka's thrusters to fire, knocking the ISS out of the proper orientation for 44 minutes before mission control could correct the problem. The Nauka module now appears to be safely attached to the orbital laboratory. However, the issue has resulted in the delay of Boeing's second uncrewed test flight of their Starliner crew capsule to no earlier than August 3rd. And for the final flight of today's episode, we have the July 30th launch of an Ariane V from Ariane Space. The heavy lift launch vehicle lifted off at 4:00 p.m. Central from the ELA-3 launch pad in French Guiana. The mission carried 2 communication satellites to geostationary transfer orbit. The first payload to be deployed was the 6,200-kilogram Star-1D2 communications satellite. Separation took place at T+2903. The second satellite was an experimental comm satellite called Eutelsat Quantum. The satellite is capable of servicing a wide range of frequencies, bandwidths, and tasks, unlike previous generations of ComSats that were all built for a single frequency or bandwidth. Separation of Eutelsat Quantum occurred 36 minutes and 25 seconds after liftoff. And finally, we'll move into our Boca Chica roundup. The Starship Super Heavy BN-3's test booster completed an apparently successful static fire of 3 Raptor engines on July 19th as the Starbase team pushes towards an orbital launch in the coming months. The static fire lasted for less than 5 seconds, but it is still the most important Super Heavy booster milestone we've seen thus far. Additionally, a 9th segment was added to the orbital launch tower that will soon be outfitted with plumbing, electrical, and other infrastructure, including a heavy lift crane for orbital Starship launches. SpaceX is firing on all cylinders to get the ground support equipment in place for the highly anticipated test flight. And with that, we conclude this episode of HyperSpace. In the coming days, we'll watch for the second uncrewed test flight of Boeing's Starliner capsule aboard United Launch Alliance's Atlas V, and the return of SpaceX launches following the landing drone ship shuffle that included the Panama Canal transit of Course I Still Love You, and the delivery of a shortfall of Gravitas to Port Canaveral. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with your friends and family, and as always, thanks for listening, and keep trucking.